Welcome to Heart Over Gold, the channel where love, kindness, and humanity shine brighter than any fortune. In today's story, Richard Leo, a billionaire CEO, is consumed by his empire and grief after the sudden death of his wife. During a business trip in Seattle, he struggles to connect with his son, Jasper, until a hotel attendant, Katrina Gregg, unexpectedly calms the crying child. This simple act of kindness forces Richard to confront his failures as a father and man, leading him to reevaluate his life. Through quiet moments with Katrina and Jasper, Richard discovers a new kind of stability, one built not on power, but on love and presence. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments, and keep up with our latest stories. A billionaire tech mogul, consumed by the demands of his empire, had no idea how a simple encounter with a hotel attendant could completely shatter his world and reshape it. Richard Leo never planned for a lengthy stay in Seattle. His visit, originally meant to be brief, had extended into nearly 3 weeks, filled with high-stakes meetings, a crucial board retreat, and a keynote address at a major tech summit. Despite the professional whirlwind, Richard found himself alone with his 18-month-old son, Jasper, at the Emerald Grand, one of the city's most prestigious hotels. Jasper, too young to understand the complexities of his father's life, could sense the emotional distance between them. Since the sudden passing of his wife, Richard had buried himself in work, juggling flights, business calls, and boardroom presentations. But Jasper didn't care about schedules or corporate deadlines. The boy only knew his father's arms were often too occupied, his focus too far away. That morning, Richard was deep into a call with European partners when he heard Jasper's cries. At first, they were soft and grumbling, but then a sharp, terrified wail pierced through his concentration. He dropped his phone, spinning around in panic. The bed was empty. His heart raced as he called out for his son, rushing to the bathroom, then to the hallway. That's when he saw her. A hotel attendant knelt near the service cart, cradling Jasper in her arms. Her demeanor was calm and composed, her dark hair tied neatly at the back, and her hotel uniform sharp and professional. She wasn't flustered, nor did she look worried. She was simply focused on Jasper, who had stopped crying. His small body relaxed against her chest. Richard stood frozen for a moment, caught off guard. The sight of Jasper resting so peacefully in the arms of a stranger felt surreal. He felt a rush of anger. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice louder than he intended. The woman glanced up without flinching, meeting his gaze. "He was alone and scared," she replied, her tone steady and unbothered. Richard approached, checking Jasper for any signs of harm. "You shouldn't be holding him. You're not family." "I know," she replied quietly, "but he needed someone." Her calmness unsettled him more than anything. She wasn't trying to justify herself or apologize. She was simply present in a way Richard hadn't been. The sight of Jasper's small hand gripping the fabric of her uniform twisted something in Richard's chest. It reminded him of the way his wife had once held Jasper, effortlessly comforting him in a way he hadn't been able to since her death. Wanting to retreat, Richard was about to snatch Jasper back when the attendant stood, gently cradling the sleeping child. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to overstep," she said with sincerity. Richard muttered, "You didn't," though part of him wished she had. She handed Jasper over, and Richard, still processing what had just happened, held him close, trying to replicate the comfort the woman had so easily provided. As she turned to leave, Richard realized he didn't even know her name. Yet, in just a few minutes, she had done what his wealth and connections couldn't, calmed his son when he needed it most. And in that moment, he wasn't sure whether to feel grateful or afraid. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. Jasper lay peacefully in his crib, unaware of the turmoil inside his father. Richard replayed the image of the attendant holding Jasper over and over. Not because it felt wrong, but because it felt, in an inexplicable way, right. She had provided a comfort Richard couldn't. Not because he hadn't tried, but because he was too consumed by the life he had built. He was supposed to be the father, the one who stayed behind to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. But she had done it in a way that made him question his role. The next day, Richard visited the hotel concierge to find the name of the attendant who had been so kind to his son. The concierge was hesitant but, after a bit of persistence, gave him the name: Katrina Gregg. She had been with the hotel for 2 years, no complaints or disciplinary issues. He found her on the 10th floor later that day, quietly working, folding linens with a focused, measured calm. When she noticed him, she straightened up, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Mr. Leo, is everything okay with your room?" "No complaints," Richard replied. I just wanted to thank you for yesterday. Katrina's expression softened slightly. You don't have to. Really, it was nothing. You didn't have to help, Richard said, his voice steady but sincere. But you did. And Jasper hasn't calmed down like that in weeks. Katrina looked away for a moment, her gaze drifting before meeting his again. He reminded me of someone. When I was little, left alone in strange places. I remember what that feels like. Richard stood quietly, taken aback by her honesty. Do you work full-time here? He asked, unsure of where the conversation was leading. Sometimes double shifts, Katrina nodded. I'm saving up for school, studying early childhood education. I used to babysit and volunteer at a community center. Richard hesitated. You're really good with kids. They don't want perfection, she replied simply. They want to feel safe. Her words lingered in Richard's mind long after she had finished speaking. It wasn't what he expected to hear from someone who worked in a hotel, but it was the kind of advice he hadn't gotten from any of his high-priced therapists. He paused before speaking again. If you're ever free, maybe you could visit Jasper. He clearly made an impression on him. Katrina's response wasn't immediate. She looked at the floor, then back at him, her expression cautious. Let me think about it. Richard nodded, turning to leave. But before he could walk away, Katrina stopped him. I'm not trying to be part of your world, she said softly. I don't belong in it. He smiled faintly. I don't think I do either anymore. As he walked away, he felt something in him shift. It wasn't about work or business or any of the things that had defined his life for so long. For the first time in a while, he felt like he was moving towards something real. In the days that followed, Richard found himself thinking about Katrina more often. Not in a romantic way, but in a quiet, unsettling way. There was something about her that unsettled him. Not because she was cold, but because she was so unapologetically herself. She didn't care about his wealth or status. That honesty made him question everything about the life he had built. One morning, as he was walking with Jasper in the stroller, he saw Katrina again, pushing her cart down the hallway. She was absorbed in her work, earbuds in, unaware of his presence. Something pulled at him, something beyond politeness. He approached her, saying her name softly. She looked up, startled, but not afraid. I was hoping we could talk, he said. She nodded and led him to a quiet corner. And as they spoke, Richard realized that what had begun as a chance encounter had quietly turned into something that would change his life forever. The hallway smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and fresh linen. It was narrow, dimly lit, and almost oddly peaceful. I'm not checking up on you, Richard said. I just wanted to, talk. Katrina leaned against the wall, arms crossed, eyes patient. You don't need to explain, he hesitated. Actually, I think I do. I keep replaying what happened that day. The way you held Jasper, it made me realize something. She waited. I don't know how to comfort him, he admitted. Not like that. Not like you did. I try. God, I try, but there's something missing. Katrina's gaze softened, but she didn't rush to fill the silence. She let him sit with his own discomfort. You know, she finally said, when I was a kid, I used to cry in the middle of the night. I'd hope someone would come. Usually no one did. Sometimes a social worker would check in, but they always left again. Eventually, I learned to be quiet. Richard didn't know why, but her words hit harder than he expected. He had never known that kind of emptiness. Not personally, but he'd seen it in the eyes of others. He'd seen it in Jasper's too sometimes. And that day, she continued, when I saw your son crying, it wasn't about doing the right thing. It was instinct. I saw a child alone, and I knew what that felt like. Richard exhaled. You say it so simply, but it meant everything. Katrina looked at him for a long time before replying. It's not hard to offer kindness. What's hard is believing it'll matter. They stood there surrounded by the hum of machines and the scent of clean cotton. Both of them suspended in the strange quiet that only truth can create. He wanted to ask her 1,000 things about her past, about what she dreamed of, about what kept her going. But he didn't want to pry. He didn't want to turn her into a project or a story he could control. I'm not trying to fix you, he said. Or Jasper, or anything, really. Katrina smiled just a little. That's good. I don't need fixing. I just need a place I don't have to run from. Richard nodded. Do you think that place could be near us? Around us, even? She tilted her head, curious. Are you offering me a job? No, not a job, he said quietly. Just a presence. I don't even know what to call it. You make him feel safe. You make me feel like maybe I'm not as lost as I think I am. For a moment, the hallway felt like a pause in time. Two people, damaged in different ways, standing in the middle of something fragile and unnamed. Katrina finally replied, her voice steady. I'll think about it. Not because I owe you anything, but because Hes mailed at me like he knew me. And I haven't felt known in a long time. They parted without promises, but something had shifted. Something small, but real. Richard walked back to the suite and found Jasper napping in a beam of sunlight on the floor, clutching a soft blue blanketto his chest. And for the first time in weeks, Richard sat beside him without checking his phone, without rushing to answer an email or schedule a meeting. He just sat there breathing slowly, letting the quiet wrap around him like something sacred. Because maybe, just maybe, healing didn't arrive in grand gestures or clean resolutions. Maybe it started in the hallway behind a laundry chute with two people admitting they were tired of surviving alone. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Richard hadn't anticipated. One that felt quiet but unfamiliar, as if he were walking through someone else's life. Trying it on for size, Katrina didn't immediately become part of his and Jasper's world. She didn't suddenly appear every day or fill his suite with warmth and conversation. Instead, things unfolded slowly, organically, the way a door cacks open rather than swings wide. It started with short visits. Katrina would stop by during her break, always tentative, always asking if it was a good time. Jasper would light up the moment he saw her, his tiny hands reaching out instinctively, his voice bubbling with the early sounds of affection. "Reina," he would say, the word not fully formed but clearly meant for her. It melted something in Richard every time he heard it. She would sit with him on the floor, letting him stack blocks or babble nonsense stories, while she listened like it was the most important conversation in the world. She had that rare quality, true patient presence. It didn't ask for attention, it simply offered it. Richard watched these moments from a short distance at first, leaning against a doorframe or sipping his coffee in silence. He wasn't sure how to participate. It wasn't just about being an outsider to the dynamic forming between Katrina and Jasper. It was about confronting how disconnected he had become from his own role as a father. It wasn't that he didn't love his son. He did fiercely. But love, he was learning, wasn't always enough when it lived only in intention. Children needed love. They could feel, touch, hear, trust, and Richard was still learning how to give it in ways that didn't rely on providing things or solving problems. One evening after Katrina had left, Richard sat in the dimly lit living room, Jasper asleep in the crib beside him. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt like it echoed. He glanced around at the expensive furniture, the untouched wine on the tray, the sleek walls of a luxury suite that now felt more like a temporary hiding place than a home. He opened his laptop, intending to dive into work, but paused instead. He opened a new document, and without fully knowing why, he began typing. He wrote about loss, about how the silence after his wife's funeral had been louder than any grief he'd expected, about the confusion of holding a newborn while drowning in boardroom schedules, about his guilt, his failures, his isolation. He wrote about Jasper crying and not knowing how to hold him properly. Hugh wrote about Katrina, about how one act of instinctual kindness had upended everything he thought he understood about strength. The words poured out like they'd been waiting too long for permission. The next day, he didn't mention the writing. He didn't know if he ever would, but he started to speak differently to himself, to Jasper, even to Katrina. One afternoon, while they sat together on the floor watching Jasper try to wedge a rubber duck between the couch cushions, Richard turned to Katrina and asked, not casually, but sincerely, "Do you think I'm failing him?" Katrina didn't answer right away. She looked at him the way she always did, steadily, like she wasn't afraid of the question. "No," she said. "I think you're learning in real time, and I think that's one of the hardest things a parent can do." He nodded, grateful but not fully reassured. "I keep wondering if he'll grow up and feel like I was absent, like I didn't try hard enough." She leaned back slightly, her voice calm. "Trying isn't about perfection. It's about showing up. And you're here. That counts for more than you think." They fell into silence again. But it was easier now, more breathable. What surprised Richard most was how quickly he started to feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. Stability. Not just in the routines with Jasper, but in his own body. He began to take deeper breaths. He began to step away from work calls without panic. He began to laugh more. Really laugh. Not the polite chuckle of business meetings, but the kind that came from the stomach, sometimes unexpected, sometimes at his own expense. One afternoon, Jasper tried to put a slice of banana into Richard's shoe, and then looked up proudly as if he'd just completed a genius prank. Katrina burst into laughter before Richard did, her face lighting up so brightly, it seemed to cast warmth across the entire suite. Richard looked at her then, not as an attendant, not as a guest in his world, but as someone who had stepped into a space where she had never been invited and made it feel more like home than anything he had built on purpose. That night, Richard stood beside Jasper's crib and watched him sleep, one tiny hand clutching the corner of his blanket, his chest rising and falling with a peace that Richard hadn't been able to give him alone. He whispered something to himself then. Words that he hadn't said aloud before. I don't want to do this without her. It wasn't a confession. It was a realization. One that would carry him into the coming days with both fear and hope. Because allowing someone in, truly in, meant letting go of control. And for a man who'd built his entire identity around holding everything together, that was both the most terrifying and the most necessary thing he could do. It was a Tuesday afternoon when everything started to unravel. The air in the hotel was unusually tense, the kind of quiet that hinted something was about to shift. Richard had taken Jasper down to the garden courtyard for some fresh air, giving Katrina a rare break. They had started to find balance, a rhythm of sorts, one that felt safe, steady, even hopeful. That rhythm shattered with a single photograph. Someone, a guest from one of the adjacent suites, had taken a picture of Katrina holding Jasper on one of the upper balconies. It had been innocent, sweet even, a candid moment where the boy had reached for her and she instinctively picked him up. The moment had lasted maybe a minute, but the photograph had captured something that the world, especially the media, loved to distort. Within hours, the image made its way to a low-level gossip site under the headline "Mystery Maid Cradles CEO's Son. Where is the father?" Within another day it was everywhere. Blog posts, hotel forums, clickbait articles. The image was cropped, filtered, and manipulated into a dozen different versions, each more salacious than the last. By Wednesday, hotel management called Richard into a private meeting. They were nervous, formal, and clearly trying to protect the brand. The head of PR used phrases like optics and potential liability. The general manager danced around the issue, but finally said what they were all thinking. Katrina needed to be removed from the floor. Just until the situation dies down, they added quickly. As if that softened the blow, Richard didn't shout. He didn't argue. He simply stood, left the meeting, and found Katrina. She was in the service corridor near the laundry chute again, folding towels with the same calm precision she always carried, but this time her shoulders were drawn, her expression guarded. She had already heard. "I'm suspended," she said before he could speak. Her tone was flat, but her eyes betrayed her. "They said they're reviewing the situation, that it's not permanent, but we both know how this goes." Richard ran a hand through his hair, tension building behind his eyes like a pressure valve about to blow. "This is my fault. I should have protected you better." Katrina shook her head. "No, Richard, this isn't about you. It's not even about Jasper. This is what happens when someone like me is seen holding the child of someone like you. It's not new. It's just exposed now." He looked at her, really looked at her, and felt an anger he hadn't known he was capable of. Not at her, not at himself, but at the world they both lived in. The one that judged people by their uniforms, by their tax brackets, by the shape of the name tags on their chest. He had built his empire thinking he could control Hambo everything, but he couldn't control this. He couldn't protect Katrina from being reduced to a headline. And it was killing him. "They're not going to reinstate you," he said quietly, "even if they pretend to consider it." "I know," she replied, folding one last towel with sharp corners. "I've already packed up my locker." He didn't know what to say after that. Words felt useless. He watched her gather her things, watched her dignity stay intact, even as her job was ripped from her. And something inside him finally snapped. That night, Richard did what no one expected. He called a reporter, not one from the tabloids, but someone with integrity. Someone who'd covered him before in the business world, and he told her the truth. Not the PR version, not the damage control narrative, the truth. He told her about his wife, about the weight of single fatherhood, about how he'd failed to be fully present in his son's earliest months. He told her about Katrina, about the moment she found Jasper on the floor crying, and how she didn't hesitate. He talked about how she showed more humanity in a hallway than most executives showed in a lifetime of boardrooms. "I didn't hire her to save my son," he said in the interview. "She just did, and I didn't ask her to stay. But she did when no one else could reach him or me." The article went live the next morning, and everything changed. For better or worse, the world now saw Katrina not as a threat or a scandal, but as a person. Some people supported her. Others criticized Richard for blurring boundaries, but the majority were moved. Something in the honesty of his voice struck a chord. Offers poured in for both of them. Job offers, sponsorships, even a book deal. But Richard declined them all. He wasn't interested in monetizing vulnerability. What he cared about now was something smaller and infinitely more important. Stability, truth, and a right to build a future without shame or permission. He found Katrina sitting on a bench outside the hotel later that week. She looked up, Ash approached, uncertainty flickering in her expression. "Why'd you do it?" She sked. He sat beside her, careful not to break the fragile space between them. "Because I was tired of hiding behind silence, and because the world deserves to know who you really are." She laughed once, dry and soft. "I'm nobody, Richard. Just a girl who folded towels and picked up a crying baby. No, he said, turning to her fully. You're the reason my son knows what comfort feels like. That makes you everything. For the first time since the scandal broke, Katrina let herself lean into something close to relief. And though nothing had been fixed overnight, and the road ahead was still complicated, one thing was clear. They were walking it together now. Not because of guilt or obligation, but because somewhere between grief and chaos, a child had reached for her, and she had stayed. Do you believe Richard made the right choice by speaking out? What would you have done in his shoes? Share your perspective in the comments. In the weeks that followed the interview, Richard's world shifted in ways she hadn't expected, and in many ways couldn't control. Public opinion moved like a tide. Some of it was supportive, empathetic, even. Parents reached out with stories of their own losses, their own regrets, and their gratitude to the people who had shown up for their children when they couldn't. But not everyone was kind. There were critics, skeptics, trolls who questioned his judgment, his leadership, his credibility as both a father and a CEO. The media picked apart his words, his body language, even the tone in which he had mentioned Katrina. Every moment of sincerity became a soundbite, and every soundbite became fodder for endless opinion pieces. The company board called an emergency meeting. Several investors were spooked, and one major partner threatened to pull out of a crucial merger unless Richard distanced himself publicly from the controversy. For years, Richard had been the golden boy of the tech world, disciplined, controlled, untouchable. Now that image was cracking. They didn't say it outright, but the message was clear. Step aside or we'll force your hand. Richard didn't fight it. Not this time. He walked into the boardroom, sat through their carefully worded concerns, and signed the resignation papers without anger. He looked around the room of power-hard ardent faces and felt not shame but relief. These were people he had built with, grown with, led, but none of them had ever really known him. They had known the numbers, the brand, the myth, but not the man. That night, he didn't go back to the penthouse suite. He didn't call his lawyers or try to fix anything. He took Jasper, bundled him in a jacket, and drove to the edge of the city where Katrina now lived. An old converted row house that smelled faintly of wood polish and something warm baking in the oven. When she opened the door, surprised but not alarmed, he just stood there for a moment, not speaking. I left the company, he said finally, voice quiet. Katrina blinked. You what? I resigned. The board wanted me out. I let them have it. Her expression didn't immediately change. She studied him for a moment, her eyes scanning for something behind the words. Why are you here? Because I'm tired of running an empire that keeps me from the only thing I care about. He shifted Jasper in his arms and added, and because I don't know what comes next, but I want to figure it out. Not alone. She stepped aside and let them in. The weeks that followed were nothing like the life Richard had known. There were no morning briefings, no corporate flights, no 10F figure negotiations. Instead, there were shared grocery lists, mismatched coffee mugs, and late nights sitting on a worn couch watching Jasper learn new words and stumble through his first unsteady steps. Richard learned how to cook without burning everything. He learned to fold baby clothes with only minor frustration. He learned to exist without being important. And Katrina, she changed too. Slowly, cautiously, but undeniably. She no longer walked like she was apologizing for taking up space. She started laughing more, laughing louder until her laughter filled the small rooms of their modest life. She enrolled in a certification program for early childhood development, and spent her mornings volunteering at the local daycare, where children gravitated to her the way Jasper always had. People began to recognize her, not from headlines but from kindness. One evening after putting Jasper to sleep, they sat on the floor of the living room, backs against the couch, a quiet radio humming in the background. The lights were dim. The air smelled faintly of vanilla, and there was a peace between them that neither dared to name too quickly. Do you miss it? Katrina asked, not looking at him. The company? She nodded. He thought for a long moment. Sometimes the clarity, the purpose. But I don't miss who I had to be in order to keep it. I was constantly chasing something I couldn't hold. I'd come home and feel like a stranger to my own son. Katrina's voice was soft but steady. And now, he said, I feel like I'm finally showing up. Not just for him, for myself too. She didn't respond right away. Then she whispered, You're not the only one who needed this second chance. Richard looked at her then, not like a man who had something to prove, but like someone who had finally learned how to see. She met his gaze and didn't look away. There was no grand declaration, no sudden romantic gesture, just the mutual understanding of two people who had found shelter in each other after weathering too many storms alone. Later that night, as Jasper stirred briefly in his sleep, and then settled again, Richard stood by the doorway of the nursery, watching his son breathe steadily under the soft nightlight. Katrina joined him, her hand brushing lightly against his. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. It wasn't the life Richard had imagined. It wasn't polished or glamorous. It was hard and raw and full of uncertainty. But it was honest, and in its quiet truth, it felt more like home than anything he had ever built from the ground up. Spring came slowly, as if unsure whether it was welcome. The city thawed beneath a reluctant sun, and with it, something inside, Richard began to soften as well. The small house they now shared with Katrina had no grand view. No staff, no marble countertops or custom furniture. But it had light, real golden light that filtered through the windows in the morning and warmed the hardwood floors. It had laughter, too, and music sometimes, and the sound of Jasper running down the hallway with a stuffed bear nearly as big as he was. There was a kind of rhythm to their life now, one that wasn't controlled by spreadsheets or investor reports, but by grocery runs, nap schedules, and the delicate balance of sharing space with someone who was slowly becoming something more than just a presence. Katrina had started working part-time at the neighborhood daycare center, where her gentle, grounded energy was something the children responded to almost immediately. She came home with paint on her clothes and crayon drawings in her pockets, often too tired to talk, but always full of a quiet pride she didn't yet know how to name. Richard had begun freelancing, consulting on projects he cared about, helping small startups find their footing, writing essays about leadership that no longer hid behind buzzwords. It wasn't about rebuilding a reputation. It was about offering something useful without losing himself again. One Saturday afternoon, Richard took Jasper to the park while Katrina stayed behind tourist. It was a warm, breezy day, and the small playground was filled with children and their parents. Jasper, now talking in short, clear sentences, clutched Richard's hand as they walked to the sandbox, already babbling excitedly about digging treasure. As he played, Richard sat on a nearby bench watching. A woman beside him glanced over and smiled. "He's yours," she asked. Richard nodded. "He's happy," she said simply. Then added, "It shows." Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops and the house filled with the smell of roasted vegetables and garlic, Jasper sat at the kitchen table with his favorite picture book. Katrina was on the couch, her hair pulled up messily, reading through an early education textbook with a highlighter in hand. Richard was washing dishes, half listening to Jasper's chatter, half watching the way Katrina absently chewed the tip of the highlighter cap when she was deep in thought. Jasper turned suddenly, slid off his chair and patted over to Katrina. He held the book out to her, and she set her notes aside immediately. He climbed into her lap and looked at her with that earnest, open look children have when they asked questions too big for their own understanding. "Are you my mommy now?" he asked. His voice so soft it barely reached Richard over the sound of the running water. Katrina didn't answer right away. Her arms instinctively wrapped around him, holding him close. Her breath caught slightly, but she didn't flinch. She looked at Richard, who stood frozen, dish towel in hand. His eyes wide, not in fear, but in something closer to awe. She looked back at Jasper and said gently, "Would you like me to be?" Jasper nodded against her chest. "I like when you hold me," she smiled, kissed the top of his head and whispered, "Then I'll hold you for as long as you need." Richard didn't speak. He didn't move. But something inside him, something long locked away, opened in that moment. Not with drama or noise, but with a silent, irrevocable certainty. Katrina wasn't just someone who had stepped in. She had stayed. She had chosen not only Jasper, but him, in the quiet, consistent way she lived every part of her life. After Jasper fell asleep that night, they stood by his door, watching him breathe. Katrina reached for Richard's hand, and he took it without hesitation. They didn't talk about what the question meant, or what the answer had changed. It was already understood. They didn't need titles or labels. They didn't need to define the edges of what they had built. It was something deeper, something earned through shared nights, early mornings, and the space between grief and hope. In a world obsessed with speed and clarity, they had chosen to build something slow, something true. And though none of them said it aloud, they all knew this wasn't a temporary arrangement. It wasn't just healing. It was home. Winter returned almost without warning, slipping into the edges of their lives with cold air under door frames and a soft blanket of frost on the windows each morning. It was their second December in the house, small, imperfect, but wholly theirs, and everything about this winter felt different than the last. The chaos had quieted, the fear had lessened, and though nothing had become perfect, everything had found a kind of peace. The days were no longer built around surviving, but around living around each other. Jasper had grown into a confident, curious little boy, now talking in full sentences, asking endless questions and reciting entire pages of his favorite books from memory. He had a habit of running into their bedroom early each morning, announcing the weather as if he were the weatherman of their little world. "It snowed again," he said one morning, climbing into their bed, cheeks flushed and eyes wide. "Can we have pancakes and a snowman?" Richard smiled, pulling him close under the blanket. Across the bed, Katrina yawned and reached for Jasper, her hand gently smoothing his messy hair. The three of them lay there for a while, listening to the wind outside and the muffled sounds of the city waking up beneath a layer of snow. It wasn't a grand life, not in the way Richard's old one had been, but it was a full one, and it felt more meaningful than any power or position he'd ever held. Katrina had officially finished her certification and was now working full-time at the daycare, where her ability to connect with children had earned her both respect and love. Richard, after much hesitation, had begun speaking again, this time not in business conferences or tech summits, but at community centers and parenting forums. He spoke about rebuilding after loss, about fatherhood, about failing and trying again. His talks weren't polished. They weren't designed for applause, but people listened because they could tell he wasn't selling anything anymore. He was simply telling the truth. The Gregg Family Center, an early education and family support center named in quiet tribute to Katrina's late mother, had just opened in the neighborhood. It had been Richard's idea, a way to build something lasting, something that reflected the values they had come to live by. Care, dignity, presence. Katrina hadn't wanted it named after her, so they chose her mother's maiden name instead, allowing the story to be about both roots and renewal. On Christmas Eve, the house was full of warmth. The scent of cinnamon and pine filled every room, and soft instrumental carols played from an old speaker in the kitchen. Jasper helped hang the last handmade ornament on their slightly crooked tree, a handprint in clay, painted unevenly in red and gold. There were no expensive gifts, no catered dinners, no photographers capturing a life curated for display. Instead, there was a small table set forth, mismatched plates, a fire crackling gently in the living room, and a kind of joy that couldn't be manufactured. After dinner they sat by the fire, Jasper curled up between them, his eyes growing heavier with each passing minute. Richard looked at Katrina, her face glowing in the firelight, her fingers running gently through Jasper's hair. He didn't need to say it. Everything that needed to be spoken had already been shown in the way they moved through each day together. Eventually, Katrina stood and carried Jasper to his bed, tucking him in with the kind of tenderness that used to belong only to a mother. Richard watched from the doorway, heart full and steady. When she returned to the living room, he took her hand and pulled her gently toward him, wrapping his arms around her in the silence. They danced slowly without music, just the ticking of the old clock on the wall and the faint sound of wind outside. There was no ceremony, no proposal, no need. What they had was already deeper than a vow. They had chosen each other long before the world knew their names, not for who they had been, but for who they'd become together. Later that night, as snow fell quietly outside and lights on the tree blinked gently in the dark, Richard wrote something in his journal. He hadn't kept one in years, but now he found himself doing it often, just a few lines each night. This time he wrote, "We are not perfect. We are not whole in the way stories often demand, but we are here. We are still. And we are home." And with that, he closed the journal, kissed Katrina's shoulder, and let the warmth of the room and the quiet of their shared life settle into his bones. He had once built a world out of success. Now he had built one out of love, and this time it would last.